Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today I'm going to talk about one of my absolute favorite techniques, especially during the springtime, and that's the floating worm, guys. The floating worm is one of the most fun ways to fish because it is so visual. You get to see the fish eat the bait the majority of the time. You get to watch your bait, you get to maneuver the bait in a manner that you want because it's all visual. It's an awesome bait for the angler to fish, not only because it's fun, but because you kind of learn from using it. You can see how the fish react. You can see how the bait moves with the twitch of your rod. And at the same time, a floating worm catches big fish and it catches numbers. So that's what we're talking about today. Before I get into the details on it, though, I do want to remind you guys that if you're looking for a little bit of help on your local lakes, check out the lake breakdowns that I've done. The link to fishthemoment.com is in the description for the video. Myself, Johnny Schultz, Randy Blockett, we've all been doing lake breakdowns. We've got most lakes covered in your area. So check those out. It's a good way to get a little bit of guidance on your local lakes. All right, guys. A lot of your local lakes during this time of year, once that water gets into the mid to upper 50s all the way through the spawn, will have a floating worm absolutely excel. I can't tell you specifically what it is, other than the fact that it's a slow moving, normally bright colored bait that is hovering around the spawning ground. So not only do you have fish that are getting uh, active and feeding for the spawn, so they're trying to feed up for the spawn, they're shallow, the floating worms right in their strike zone. You also have fish that are bedding and protecting fry, and a floating worm is one of those baits that's making quick, erratic motions. It's bright colored and aggressive, and the fish don't like it around when they're getting ready for the spawn or during the spawn. And that's what makes it so good. But there are definitely some things to it that you want to be aware of, in my opinion. So, first, let's just talk about the bait. So, this is a methylate colored worm. Generally speaking, you're going to be using a bright colored worm. You've got here a lime green, we've got a white, we've got yellows, you might have bubble gum. This is one of my favorites. This is a black and yellow one. Generally speaking, you want a loud, aggressive color for the reasons I just mentioned. You want it to get in the fish's face. You want the fish to feel threatened by it because a lot of the fish are either feeding up for the spawn or they're in a protective mode because they've got eggs or they've got fry around. And in any of those instances, the louder, more aggressive, threatening bait you can throw generally will lead to a lot more bites. So that's why you want a good bright color. Most of these baits, when you throw a color like that on a sunny day, they grab the sunlight and they glow in the water. It's a very cool, mesmerizing thing to see. So you want a bright colored bait, in my opinion. The other key to having a bright colored bait is it's easy for you to see. Because a lot of this technique is visual, you want to be able to see your bait. You want to be able to see where your bait is at in the water column, and you want to be able to see if a fish is eating your bait or not. A lot of times you won't actually see the fish, you'll just see your fish disappear or your bait disappear. So it's one of those things where you want to be watching, and the bright colored bait helps with that. It's kind of similar to sight fishing. A lot of people like to use bright colored baits, not because it necessarily is better for getting the fish to bite, but because they can see the bait on the bed. It's similar with a floating worm. So when I rig this bait, there's a couple of things that I like to do. I like to have an EWG style hook. I generally go with a smaller hook. So this is a 3/0 Fusion Berkeley Fusion 19 EWG style hook. I usually will not skin hook the Texas rig. So you can see I've got the point sticking through. If I'm fishing relatively open water where I'm not bringing it through cover, I will leave it exposed like that. If I'm fishing around bushes or I'm fishing around laydowns or some grass, I will go ahead and skin hook it. But if I don't have to skin hook it, I'm not going to. But there are a lot of times, this bait is a very weedless bait, and there's a lot of times you're working it through brush and through laydowns and just things on the shoreline where you're going to need to have it actually Texas rigged and weedless. But if I can leave it exposed a lot of times, I will do that. Another thing that I like to do is I prefer to rig the bottom of the bait. Most of these baits will have a flat side on the bottom. In this case, I want to have my hook point on the rounded side so that the flat side is on the bottom. And what that does is when the bait's gliding through the water, The flat side is keeping the bait rising. It's not necessarily sinking it. If you turn it over, that's a good way to go if you want to get it deeper. You'll actually get your bait a little bit deeper. So if you're fishing, you know, a super clear body of water where you want your bait down 3 or 4 feet, that's a good way to do it. It's not going to make a huge difference, but you'll see when you twitch your bait, if you've got the flat side down and you twitch it, the bait will want to rise. If you've got the flat side up, a lot of times the bait will want to dive a little bit deeper when you twitch it. That's a good tip that you want to remember. The other thing is, if you do want to get this bait deeper, because sometimes you're not fishing that, 1 to 4 feet of water, you're actually going to be fishing, say, 4 to 8 feet of water, which happens a lot of times on lakes that have more vertical banks. I've had some tournaments on Beaver Lake in the past where I was throwing a floating worm, but the fish were deeper. It's a super clear body of water. So I wanted to get my worm deeper. A good tip to that is you can take a real light nail weight and you can insert it right inside, under your hook, right in that meat section. And that little tiny bit of weight will keep your bait sinking more level in the water, but it'll also allow you to get down deeper and you'll keep the same good gliding motion. If you put a nail weight further up in the head or further back in the tail, you're going to have more of that Nico where it's going to want to go straight down on the fall. You don't want that. If you're going to add any weight at all, you want your bait still to fall this way. So you either want to put your weight right under the hook or right in the egg sac behind the hook to try to keep it as neutral as possible. But generally, I don't want to use weight. If I can get away without using weight, that's a better way to go. So the last part about this for me is I like to use a very small swivel, 12 to 14 inches in front of the bait. And so this is a size 10. So that's how small it is. I mean, it's a 35-pound test rated swivel. I put that about 14 inches in front of the worm, and then I'll run an additional leader from the swivel to a braided main line, a 10-pound X9 braided main line of about another 4 or 5 feet, because I want to have a good distance between my braid and my worm. That's me personally. I know some people run braid to their swivel. Some people run braid right to the worm. Some people will run straight fluorocarbon. I think if I've got about a 6-foot leader between my braid and the worm itself, that's enough distance to kind of separate the braid away. But generally, I like to have longer leaders. You don't have to do that, but it makes a difference for me. The swivel is a key here, though, because you do get a lot of line twist with a floating worm. You want to have a swivel that's going to, kind of counteract some of that twisting motion. And I just like to go with the smallest side as possible. If I'm throwing 8 or 10-pound fluorocarbon line to a 10-pound X9 Berkeley braided main line, then a small swivel like this is all I need because the line's going to break before the swivel. So the smallest swivel possible is huge in my opinion. So that's my setup. When it comes to a retrieve of it, it's really up to what the fish want that day. Some days you want to twitch it and let it fall to the bottom, twitch it off the bottom, rise it back up in the water and let it fall. Other days they just want constant twitch, 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 twitch. You're almost walking the dog with your worm under the water. For me, a lot of times, like the key is just a bunch of twitches, let it fall a little bit, a bunch of twitches, but it's really up to the angler to determine what the fish want that day. And a lot of times you'll see the fish off in the distance, so you can tell how they react to the bait and the twitching of the bait. But, really the biggest thing is more about where you're fishing it. There's a lot of places, in my opinion, that really excel with a floating worm. Your highland impoundments, your lakes that are generally more rocky, it seems like the floating worm is really, really a good bait to go with during the springtime because of the fact that a lot of times that's a little bit clearer water. You get better glow from your worm in clearer water, and it just seems like the fish are seeing it and coming from further distance. You can still throw a floating worm in off-colored, even muddy water, but it doesn't seem to be quite as well. So for me, if I'm fishing a highland impoundment type body of water where you've got more 45-degree banks and then kind of flat pockets in the back of those creek arms, those are really good. Your rock transitions are really good. And then anywhere you've got spawning composition on the ground. So whether you've got nice pea gravel, you've got a bunch of, twigs or sticks or bushes in the water. Any place you know that the fish spawn, that's a good place to be throwing a floating worm. You know, a lot of times your pad stems, if you've got some new pad fields that are coming up, those are good areas because you can work the worm right through the pad stems. You're really just going for, the areas that the fish are getting into to spawn. It's just a great bait for getting those fish that a lot of times you see cruising to commit to the bait. It's really a great bait. For me, once the water temp gets into that upper 50s range all the way through the spawn, it's a killer bait. That's when it really shines. You can also catch fish year round on it though. It's a great bait during the summer still. It just seems like you've got you don't have the same drawing power. And I think it's because the fish aren't necessarily as aggressive in terms of protecting fry and their eggs and their nests, that type of thing. But it still works great during the summer months. You can catch them in the fall too when the fish start moving shallow again. It's really a very, very good bait, and it's a very entertaining bait to use. So if you haven't thrown a floating worm, guys, I highly recommend you get yourself some bright colored worms. You go out and you throw it around. One last thing I'm going to add in is I like to throw it on spinning gear. You can throw it on bait casting gear, but I feel like I'm more accurate on spinning gear with that lighter pound test and a lighter rigged worm. But feel free to throw it on bait casting gear. A lot of guys do that as well. It's up to the angler in that case, but either way, guys, get yourself some floating worms, head out to the lake. This is about the time if you're down south you want to be throwing one. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. Another video coming out tomorrow.